Live. Oh,
And now we will go live.
hi. Could you pin us, please? Brendan
Yes,
and myself. Great.
there we go.
Hi, everyone. Just give a minute. We're live on Facebook. Yes. Great.
We are preparing to go live.
Okay, great. And you have us pinned, right?
Yes.
Great, great. Got it. Great. So aloha kako. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. I hope everyone has their lunch and is ready to have a really good conversation. Welcome to Redbud's Facebook Live event. Awesome. I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you. So again, aloha kako. My name is Sheridan Noyamani Inamoto, and I am the resource specialist at Redbud Resource Group. Redbud Resource Group is a nonprofit organization dedicated to Native advocacy by building bridges between Native and non-Native communities. And our mission is to help improve public health outcomes for Native American communities through education, research, and community partnership. So we have a program at Redbud called Going Beyond Land Acknowledgement. And in this program, we work with organizations, institutions, and employers to help them become valued partners with Native peoples and their communities. And also in our Going Beyond Land Acknowledgements program, we provide tools and resources to help you assist to go beyond land acknowledgements. You can find these tools and resources at our Redbud Resource Group website at redbudresourcegroup.org under Going Beyond Land Acknowledgements. So this conversation, a conversation on cultural easements, is under our Going Beyond Land Acknowledgements program. It's the first of hope more events to come in really highlighting resources and thinking about different ways of how we go beyond land acknowledgements. I'm really, really excited to have Brendan Moriarty from the City of Oakland to talk about his work. His work also working with Native communities and to just kind of dive into a really good topic. So hopefully everybody's ready to listen and to learn. I know I am. And yeah, I'm just really excited to have this conversation. And thank you everybody for taking the time and joining us today. So Brendan, without further ado, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and just share what you do and how you're joining us today?
Great. Yes, thank you. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking some time to hear about the work that we've done here in Oakland. It's an honor to be here. So thank you for the invitation, Sheridan. So my name is Brendan Moriarty, and I am the real estate manager for the City of Oakland, which means I manage the team of people who handle the city's real estate transactions and manage the city's portfolio of property. Which is a lot of land, some buildings, from the hills down to the bay. And I've been with the City of Oakland for about 3 years now. I joined just before the pandemic started. And before that, spent 10 years at the Trust for Public Land, managing the Bay Area Conservation Program for that organization, which is a national land conservation group that had a history of doing land back projects before I think there was a lot of attention to that. And so I had I think the good fortune of sort of being in the right place at the right time, both at the Trust for Public Land and at the City of Oakland, when there was basically an opportunity in both those cases to do land back projects. So I have an example from those Trust for Public Land days, from the Sonoma County coast. I have an example now here in Oakland where we return land through a cultural conservation easement, and happy to share that experience here today. So
Awesome.
Sheridan, would you like me to go ahead and tell the story?
Go ahead, go for it. Yep.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna present a few slides here, not a lot of text, really more about helping people sort of get grounded in the place. So just give me a moment while I set this up here. All right. So let's start with the location. So we are talking about the city of Oakland here. And this was an effort to return public land in Oakland to indigenous stewardship in perpetuity. I'll talk about how this came about, but just to kind of get grounded with the location, the project was in Joaquin Miller Park, which is the city of Oakland's largest public park. It's about 500 acres up in the hills. It's a really well-loved, well-used public open space, and it's been that way for decades and decades. And it was a spot known as Sogorea Point, which is on the eastern edge of the city of Oakland here. So just really literally a boundary of the project area is the end of Oakland and the beginning of unincorporated Alameda County. It is adjacent to East Bay Regional Park District land. So it's surrounded by, on the east side, by Roberts Redwoods, and then on the west side, it's Joaquin Miller Park. And, it's a really beautiful setting. This is what it looks like from the air. It's right on a sort of a switchback on Skyline Boulevard. This is sort of looking northwest, forested and, and actually pretty quiet given the fact that you are in Oakland and by a road and inside one of our most heavily used parks. There's views of the San Francisco Bay from the site, really incredible sweeping views. They're probably even more sweeping back in the day, but there's been growth around the edge of the site. But as you come in, and this was actively used at some point in generations past, and there's this paved area here, I think, where people often in the past would come and park their cars and get views of the bay and sort of just take in that scenery. But it has fallen into disrepair today. There's like broken retaining walls and cracks in the asphalt, and it's just not actively managed. But it has those views and that connection with the open space all around it. So it's a really tremendous opportunity for restoration. It's also near a really popular public hiking trail, the Big Trees Trail, if anyone lives locally and knows that. There's a few social trails that run through the property, but those are not really on the map formally. And it's largely unused by the public, aside from illegal dumping, unfortunately. So let me go to this picture while I say a little bit more about it. So the way this came about in the first place was around 2018. The then mayor of the city of Oakland, Libby Schaff, and reached out to Karina Gould, a leader in our local Native American community. Karina Gould is the chairwoman for the Confederated Villages of Lejeune, and also a director of the Sogorea Té Land Trust, which works on land back. And Mayor Schaff invited Karina in and basically wanted to begin a conversation of starting to repair the harm that had been done on her community hundreds of years ago, but also ongoingly, and really invited the conversation about what would be most meaningful to you, what's going to be the most impactful to you. And Karina brought up land back and getting land back that was stolen. And the mayor said, basically invited her to go around and look at all of the city's lands and identify a location that was important and meaningful that she would like to have back for her community. And that's how Karina and the Sogorea Té Land Trust ultimately identified this site here in Sogorea Point. And when I joined the city in January of 2020, the end of my very first week on the job, it was very fortuitous, that was the week we were signing the letter of intent. So I got to meet the mayor and Karina. I had actually known Karina and worked with her before, but we met out on site and actually signed the document that said, hey, we're committed to doing this. And this is kind of the basic picture of how this would work. Let's get to work and make it happen. And that commenced about a 2.5, almost 3-year process of implementation. And we finally did get it done. But in terms of let me just start with like what the conservation easement is. I think probably a lot of people on the call understand that, but I'll start there and then I'm going to get into how we apply it here. The use of a conservation easement as the tool for land back here was the tool that the land trust identified as what they wanted. Rather than acquiring the land, title to the land outright, I think they were interested in using this as an opportunity to A, innovate, to create a new tool that can be applied elsewhere, but then also to like build bridges and partnership and create cross-cultural dialogue and understanding and kind of really grow that partnership with the city and then with the people of Oakland. And by using a conservation easement, that means that both the land trust and the city of Oakland have rights to this land, and we are bound at the hip, working together in perpetuity. So that's how we arrived on this as the basic tool. You know, conservation easements have been used and proven as an effective conservation tool around the country for decades. They're typically used to protect land as open space or to protect its conservation values. And they typically divide the property rights between the landowner and a conservation-minded land trust or governmental agency, whoever the easement holder is going to be. They're not unheard of in an urban environment. They're typical, but they're not commonly used in urban environments, much more commonly in like rural or suburban settings where you have larger acreages. So we were we were bringing that into the urban context. Basically the basic concept here is that the landowner in all these cases, right, is agreeing to transfer some of their rights as the owner of the property to the land trust. And it's typically the right to like subdivide the property or develop it, do things that basically are going to harm conservation values. Those land rights are rights that the landowner, you know, says, look, I'm going to give those up. I'm going to give those land trusts. I'm going to bind my hands, and I'm not going to do those things forevermore. The rights are typically very limited and prescribed. The landowner is only going to give up, you know, A, B, C, and D. But then everything else imaginable that's involved in property rights remains with the landowner. And the owner remains still the owner on paper and still the owner in day-to-day practice. What we did here was a little bit different. We used a model of conservation easement that is not frequently used. It's been around for a little while, but just not commonly used, called a reserved interest conservation easement. And here, I think we broke some new ground in employing this tool, particularly for land back. And basically what it does is, like, while the city retains ownership of the property, we're still the owner of record. We still hold title. All of the property rights transferred to the land trust, excepting only those that we explicitly like enumerated and reserved to the city in the conservation easement. So the city is still the owner on paper. We have some rights, but they're very limited. They're prescribed in the document, and beyond those limited rights, all of the other rights of ownership convey over to the land trust. It's almost as if we convey title, but we used a conservation easement and we held back certain rights. Like, you know, actually, I'll get into those in a minute, what those actually were. The memorandum of agreement. So we had a second document that went along with this. The conservation easement itself is a perpetual document that we recorded, and we tend to never touch that again. That's the perpetual return of rights to our native neighbors. But we also recognize that circumstances can change on the ground. We're dealing with illegal dumping today in Oakland. It's a really big problem. Hopefully in the future, this becomes less of a problem, but we need to deal with that today. And so we coupled the conservation easement with a memorandum of agreement, or an MOA. So whereas the conservation easement conveyed certain rights in perpetuity, the memorandum was intended to be this like living document in which we set forth agreements on how we were going to implement our respective rights on the site. Because again, we're living together now on the same 4 acres, sort of like an operating manual. So how will we deal with illegal dumping? So out of the gates, the city's going to handle it around the edges, and the land trust is going to handle it on the interior of the property. But we may want to change that in the future. So we will be able to do that administratively. I should say, should tip the cap to the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District down on the peninsula. They sort of innovated, for us at least, this idea of coupling an easement with a memorandum of agreement when they granted a cultural conservation easement on Mount Umunum to the Amamutsan tribal band several years prior. So we sort of took that, we sort of borrowed from that and how we approached our transaction here. So in terms of what like the actual rights are, in general, the land trust is given the right to use the property in any way that is consistent with consistent with protecting and enhancing the conservation values of the property. So we go about defining those conservation values, and some of them are really common and familiar to those in the land trust community, like, the property's natural resource values, such as its wildlife habitat, its open space characteristics and scenic characteristics. But we added into that sort of bundle of conservation values the property's cultural and historic value. So we're now saying this property is important not just for its natural resources, not just for its open space characteristic, and not just for its views, but for the fact that it's really an important and sacred space to a certain group of people that were here pre-contact. And we also define the property's educational value as something we want to preserve as well. So we define these values as like the things that we really care about, and just sort of make a blanket statement that uses that are going to harm those conservation values are going to be prohibited, and uses that protect them or enhance them are going to be allowed. And that's like the North Star that we follow throughout the document, and where there's ambiguity in the future, we'll refer back to that. So the zoning still applies here. This is a very restrictive zoning designation in Oakland. It's our most restrictive form of open space. And that really limits the land trust rights as of right now on what they can actually do there. They can steward and maintain the site. They can implement natural resource restoration projects, practice cultural and ceremonial traditions. They can educate the public, and they can manage public access. They can actually close, the site is open to the public. They wanted that, but they also have the right to close it down during times of ceremony when privacy is important, and to close it down in cases of natural resource restoration projects where you can't have people trampling over plantings, for example. But they have a broader vision for the site as well. And here now I'll go ahead and advance to some other slides. I'm going to come back to these. This is the signing ceremony, but this is the ultimate vision of a ceremonial structure on the site as well, which may or may not at the end of the day involve a fire pit, but it's kind of designed to be evocative of a basket, and is a place for ceremony and coming together as a community, and having education. It's set within, in land that's been restored, that they're going to be undertaking restoration of. Really beautiful renderings that we're seeing, but this structure is not something that's allowed by zoning today. But we want to provide for that. And by virtue of doing a reserved interest conservation easement, we basically are acknowledging that, like, hey, in the future, if the zoning changes and more uses are allowed on the site, then provided that you do things that, again, are consistent with the conservation values and don't harm those conservation values, and remembering that that cultural and historic value is one of the things that are to be protected and enhanced, then they can do that. And so this is the sort of thing that would be allowed, and kind of in a phase 2 of this project, which I'll get to in a moment, we are going to address those zoning constraints. So in terms of what the city is retaining in this reserve interest model, it's not a whole lot. We reserve the right to collaborate with the land trust on a management plan. They will design a management plan for the property. We're going to be a stakeholder in that. We'll collaborate with them. We have the right to coordinate public access with the land trust, not to dictate it, but to coordinate it. We have the right to supplement their maintenance of the site if it's needed. The land trust is growing and building capacity at a remarkable pace, but we also recognize, that they're still relatively small, and this is one of the larger sites that they have. And so, there's, I think, an opportunity to collaborate around maintenance, and so we might try to change that dial over time. But the right is really to supplement their maintenance, not to dictate maintenance or take over. We have the city has the right to prohibit access to the property on red flag days. So if there's really high fire danger, we can say, look, nobody can be there today. And we have the right to enforce applicable laws and regulations. But aside from that, all the bundles of sticks of property rights, that's going on has gone now over to the land trust. The benefits of doing this were significant, right? This is directly, obviously beneficial to Oakland's indigenous community and to the Confederated Villages of Lashon. It's a symbolic, act of righting historic wrong, and it's tangible. The land trust is better equipped to speak to the importance of this, and I don't want to try to speak for them, but it's powerful and it's important. Also, there's a moral imperative for the city. I mean, we're a city that's committed to racial equity, grappling with a difficult past and striving towards a more equitable future. And That means also addressing the inequities that have harmed our Indigenous community as well. This also creates a new deeply rooted partnership. As I was saying, this is a piece of ground in Joaquin Miller Park that the city has not managed actively. We have a lot of land and limited resources to maintain it. And if we can bring in a partnership that's going to bring motivation and organization and community and resources and a sense of mission, it's just going to be, that's additive to Joaquin Miller Park. It's also going to create opportunities for the public to be educated. It's going to create opportunities to be informed of cultural practice and natural resource restoration, that sort of thing. So really, really cool benefits. And it didn't take much for the city to do this fiscally. We already owned this. This was public land. There was some out-of-pocket costs associated with closing and doing a survey, but we were giving land back. That doesn't take a lot of money necessarily. It did take a lot of staff time. We spent about 3 years on this. I think longer than it should take, but we were up against a number of barriers that were specific to the site. We also, again, we're trying to innovate in creating a new model, and hopefully wouldn't be so burdensome and time consuming for other jurisdictions. But what it took to get it ultimately done from a kind of an authorization standpoint was to take this to our city council. We first did have some community engagement, town hall hosted by the council member who represents this part of Oakland. We met with just a tremendous amount of support. It was very uplifting to hear the people of Oakland, speak up in support of this, and questions about how it would work, certainly, but there wasn't really pushback. Everyone really saw how this was important and that the time was now. We took it to our Parks and Recreation Advisory Commission that then sort of advised City Council that, hey, this is a good thing to do in the context of Joaquin Miller Park. And then it went to our City Council. That was back in November of 2022 for a first reading in November and then a second reading in December. And then it was official with the authority to do it. And so just towards the end of the year, we had a signing ceremony up at Chabot Space and Science Center, which is also in Joaquin Miller Park, where we actually signed the deed. And it was just an incredibly powerful moment, really moving evening. And this is Karina and myself signing the documents. I got to say, it was just one of the, a real professional highlight. Working on these land back projects is just incredibly powerful. And so here we are right after we had signed it, and you can see Mayor Schaaf standing next to Karina. Okay, so let's see, what else do I want to say here? So the rezoning, I mentioned that, we're not really done yet. We still have this issue of the zoning being incredibly restrictive. And there's a kind of a theory behind this to think about, that zoning at its core is a set of rules that dictate how people can use land. And these were rules that were imposed on the native people here. They weren't invited to create these rules. These rules didn't exist before this area was settled. So these are rules that were imposed and really took sovereignty away. And so it's one stroke of restoring sovereignty to return the property rights to these acres here. It's another matter of sovereignty to address these zoning restrictions that limit how they can use the land now that they have it back. There's certain things that we still need to think about, like that are appropriate for the property. But we thought about that with the conservation easement. The things that needed to be addressed, like fire risk, are in the conservation easement. And to have a whole nother layer of zoning saying what can and can't be done is simply another imposition, another legacy of of racism and colonialization that we want to strip away. And so we're working now on a zoning amendment that will address this. And it's necessary to build this structure. We don't have it completely ironed out yet. The basic idea is to say on properties where there is a cultural conservation easement or a conservation easement that defines what can and can't be done there, that those properties, the uses that are allowed on that ground are going to be determined by the conservation easement and not by zoning. So it's essentially an exemption out of zoning where you have a cultural conservation easement that the city put together in partnership with in this case, the Sogorea Té Land Trust. So hope to move that through this year. Hopefully by the end of the year, we're in a position where that's been instituted, and that will really unlock the full vision for the land trust. So that is the basic story, and I can get into depth on other thing. I can also talk a little bit more about my experience with the land back on the Sonoma County coast, and I can also, actually, maybe we'll go ahead and say this right now. The final thing to understand, I think, is like this cultural conservation easement is a tool. It is one of numerous tools, or put another way, one of different flavors of land backs. There's not like one way to do it. And different approaches make sense in different circumstances. In the case on the Sonoma County coast, that was with the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians, and they're working through the Trust for Public Land. We acquired about a mile of the California coastline in fee. We actually acquired title to it and conveyed it back to the Kashaya. So that's kind of on the spectrum of land back, in a sense, like one end of it, where it's a full conveyance of rights back to a tribe, the full ownership of the property. On the other end, you know, there's lighter touches, like actually in that same area, the Save the Redwoods League did a transaction with the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians as well at Stewart's Point. It's a preserve owned by the league, and they granted them a cultural and subsistence access easement. So it basically gives certain rights to the tribe to come onto the property at certain times and you know, harvest or have ceremony and that sort of thing. It's just kind of like very prescribed set of access rights. That's kind of on the other end of the spectrum. That's not watered down at all. I mean, that just necessarily, it's just a different approach in a different location with its own circumstance. And then kind of somewhere in between these two examples, you have this conservation easement model, and you have the Mount Umanum example, which is like a traditional conservation easement, where it says, you know, we're going to give a certain enumerated set of rights over to the Amamutsan tribal band, but Mid-Pen, as the property owner, is going to retain everything else. And then you have what we did, which is now a little more towards like the full end of the spectrum, like with the fee conveyance to the Kashaya that the Trust for Public Land did, where it is a cultural conservation easement. It's not a fee conveyance, but in the reserved interest model that we use, the way that we wrote it, it gets awfully close to a fee conveyance. So, you know, I kind of imagine as a spectrum, and those are just some tools, but there's other tools, and, you know, you can kind of place yourself anywhere there. I think the way to do it, though, is just to start from conversation, you know, and understanding, you know, what are the goals, what do the parties want, and what works in this case, and then you can figure out the tool that maps to that. So that's okay. That's where I really will pause.
That's great. Thank you, Brendan. I think you kind of answered some of the questions that I started to have, especially around process. So maybe more of a questions around processing, and you started kind of touching on things to consider when you're going into these kinds of agreements or talking about easements. A couple of questions related to process for you. Again, you know, how would you describe the key differences between these different types of easements? You know, more typical cultural or conservation easement. I know I spoke with tribal chairperson Karina from the Confederated Villages of Lashawn. I think it's important to recognize too that they are not a federally recognized tribe, even though they're recognized by the state. This is a really good example of the fact that there's always an opportunity to work with any tribe or native communities or native folks in your community to do something around land back. So I just want to also add that. And then I also know that the official type of easement that was created is called the Reserved Interest Cultural Conservation Easement. Mm-hmm. Is that correct, Brendan? Yeah. So just I guess going back to the key differences of these kinds of easements, obviously the creativity of that too, but thinking about the practice, the process, like what are some things that you started to highlight, like that we need to consider if you're wanting to work with a native community or tribe in creating an MOA? Is that, you know, I think it's important to address the diversity with depending on where you are in your community and what native groups are there. But anything you want to share about just how you start the process, and you know, if you want to go into working with the easement conversation with a native community or tribe.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard a few questions in there. I'll start with the last one around like how to get started. In the case here in Oakland, I really like the way that Mayor Schaaf started this, which was by listening. It was an invitation to, to Karina representing our native community here in Oakland, with the Confederated Villages of the Shawn, to say, basically, Karina, I want to hear about your experience, the experience of your community, and what would be meaningful to you. What does restitution look like? What does social justice look like for you? And what can we do? Rather than jumping to an assumption about what they're going to want, rather than saying, hey, we got this piece of land, we want to give it to you, or rather than assuming one thing or another, I think just coming in from a standpoint of like just starting about like what's meaningful to you and what do you want. And that's a really cool approach. And that gave the initial shape to this. It identified the location. First, it got us in the arena of land back, and then it got us into the arena of this particular location. And then it got us focused on using a conservation easement as a tool. And it also created a lot of trust right at the outset that like the city was really here as a true partner, with a great deal of respect, that's not going to try to necessarily dictate everything. And it's a really important foundation, particularly when a project's going to take 5 years from start to finish, to start at a place of trust and respect. So that's one thing I would say, as to how to get it started. The reserved interest model may not make sense everywhere. Like I said, it really is like kind of almost like a full land back. And in Oakland, we really met with broad support for this. And, I think we're a community that for the most part is pretty committed to social justice, advancing social justice. So we didn't have a lot of friction there, but I can imagine other communities that might be a little more challenging. But of course, you can write a conservation easement, whether using a reserved interest model or a traditional model. You can write it in so many different ways to address, the particularities of a circumstance. So I think it's a really nice tool for doing land back, but it does mean that there will, and this could be a good thing like it is here, it does mean an ongoing partnership. It's not like, here's the land, we're done, job's done. It's like, no, we're kind of, wet at the hip. And for us, I think that's going to result in a lot of growth, a lot of forward progress. I'm really excited about that. Does that answer the question? I think there was maybe some other questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. That does answer the question. I think you really speak to what I really like what you were saying about thinking about a relationship, right? That you're in it for the long term. It's a long-term commitment. It's an ongoing long-term partnership relationship. It's not just a checklist type of experience or event or conversation even. It's for the long haul, right? And it's thinking about, I know, in multiple generations, because even Brendan, even after you leave, right? Or it's the different people in the city of Oakland that will be able to be established and hopefully upheld within the city, even if you yourself or other folks in the city move on from your work, right? I think this is why these types of agreements are important to consider and to think about. There is another question, just for a little bit more like just basic 101, like what is a fee conveyance? What does that mean? And is that applicable to the Amamutsin conservation easement? How does that apply? Could you kind of dig a little bit more into what that is and share?
Right. Yeah, that was some jargon. So fee conveyance, it's like conveying fee title, which is to say actually giving ownership of property, conveying ownership of property to another entity. So if I'm going to, like in the case of the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians up on the Sonoma County coast, that was a fee conveyance, meaning, we bought the property from this family that had had it for multiple generations, and we conveyed ownership of that property back to the tribe. It wasn't just a certain bit of the rights through a conservation easement. It was actually ownership of the property. That's what we mean by fee conveyance. And then that's what was used in that case. the Mount Umunum example was not a fee conveyance. So the Mid-Penn still, the public park district still owns that preserve, that public preserve. But they conveyed the cultural conservation easement to the Amamutsun tribal band. And through that easement, they gave the tribe certain rights to use that land and to practice ceremony on it, et cetera. And what they're allowed to do is as written in that conservation easement. And I should say these transactions, once they're done, they're a matter of public record. So, if there's a fee conveyance of a piece of property and you're returning title to a tribe, like there will be a document that says that, and it's recorded at the county clerk and recorder's office, and it documents that they own it now. And same with the conservation easements. So the cultural conservation easement that happened in Mount Umunum, the one that we did in Oakland, those documents and all their terms, like they're available. So if anyone wants to kind of geek out on this and actually see the language, you can either go to the recorder's office or we can just circulate that. I can make sure that Sheridan has that document and can make it available.
Thank you. That would be great. And yes, and just so everybody that's watching this conversation this afternoon, it is being recorded and it will reappear on our Redbud Resource Group website under our Going Beyond Land Acknowledgements Resources database page, along with those documents. Brendan, that would be great to be able to share and for folks to access after this conversation. If other folks want to have questions for Brendan or about this process, I think we have another question already. We have some time, so I'm just going to jump into some more questions. What do you think is the next in the evolution of easements for land return? What are you curious about? What ideas do you have? What are your thoughts, Brendan?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think it would be great to figure out how to make this easier. The fact that we spent 5 years in Oakland, that's kind of problematic. That's a slow pace. I think organizations like Rosebud and the Sogorea Té Land Trust and others are going to help to create a body of knowledge and education that hopefully everyone can learn from and evolve and kind of make these processes move more quickly. I think it's also building a library of options. Like we borrowed from what Mid-Penn had done. I was able to borrow from what we had done with the Kashai Band of Pomo Indians through Trust for Public Land. So we're kind of like grabbing ideas as we go. And the next project's gonna probably do the same thing and borrow a little bit from what Oakland did. The more we have like a library available, I think the more we can build that best practice and carry ideas forward and across geography. I think there's a lot of opportunity space there. I think it'd be really interesting to see how public agencies continue to do this. Land trusts are, there's a lot of activity, I think, with like private properties and getting them protected and then figuring out how to incorporate tribes in those transactions. We've already got a lot of public land that owned locally or by the state and by the federal government. And a lot of that land became public land through pretty heavy-handed ways. So I'm really interested to see how land back can happen and grow on public land. And that's going to be an interesting dialogue with the public too. Like I said, in Oakland, this went over really well. And I think part of it was because we found a piece of the park that had sort of been forgotten and overgrown and was dilapidated. But what if we had chosen a much more prominent location? Would we have been met with resistance? I don't know. What if we're talking about a state park, a beloved state park, very prominent part of a state park? Like, what kind of resistance might there be, or hopefully a great deal of support? In terms of the technical side of things, there's probably another really cool idea right around the corner, and I don't know what it is. It's hard to anticipate that, but it's gonna be exciting to see what it is. And because every piece of ground is different, we're going to be surprised, and it's going to be driven by the circumstances of that site and of the partners that are at the table. I found it really neat how it's a separate idea now. Like, this idea of land back is super important for addressing the harms done on our native communities in this country, and can also be a tool that I think we should be thinking about with other communities who were similarly harmed by land being stolen from them. And there's a really cool example of a land back that was done in Southern California, a piece of coastal property, the public park, and it had been basically condemned decades ago, taken from an African American family that had been operating. It was like a summer, I believe it was like kind of like a summer retreat, a place where it was a safe place for Black families to come and have an experience on the coast, but it was set within a community that otherwise was predominantly white. And so the local government condemned that property basically to drive that community out of town. And in just in the last few years here, there was a land back that was done there to return that land or rights to that land to the family who had it taken wrongly. So it'll be interesting to see how this notion of land back can apply to other communities that have experienced similar land-based injustices. I'm curious to see how that evolves too.
Great, thank you for that. Actually, I have a question to kind of add to the previous question of thinking about land back from your perspective, Brendan, and how it's mutually beneficial. Could you think about what are some mutual benefits when this experience that you're having with land back, working with Native local communities, could you describe some of those benefits?
Yeah. So I've spoken to it a little bit already, but the fact that here in Oakland, we didn't have the means to care. We don't have the means to care for every last square foot of Joaquin Miller Park the way it should be cared for. And this place was getting a lot of dumping, and it wasn't cared for, and there was fire hazard, and trees were dying, and all these problems. And the fact that we now have this partner that has a mission around conservation and connecting people to the land and land-based cultural practices means like this land's going to be taken care of now, in a way that we weren't showing we were up to the task. So I think that's a clear mutual benefit. And also the opportunity to have education right here in Oakland about the history of this place that's more holistic, that's not a history that's just 100 years old or 150 years old, but can go deeper than that. We get some of that in some places, but this is gonna, I think it'll, at the end of the day, be a fairly prominent platform to tell a more holistic story of Oakland for everybody's benefit. I think those are the things that sort of rise to top for me. Plus, just like knowing you did the right thing feels amazing, and having wounds in your community is like, that's not good for society, So I think there's mutual benefit in taking the actions to try to, do right by people that were wronged.
Awesome, thank you, Brendan. We have a couple more questions from our Facebook Live folks. Great. So there's a great presentation. I'm sorry if I missed this, but why didn't the city want to do a fee transfer? That's the first question.
Right. That was really the preference of the Sogorea Té Land Trust in this case, wanting to, when this process started, I mentioned how they've grown, they continue to grow like really rapidly. It's impressive. In 2018, they were smaller and didn't have as much of a land base as it was. And this was a big bite, a big, relatively big piece of land for them up in the hills. Set amongst heavily used public open space. I think there was a desire to make sure that they were able to do this in a way that where they could be successful, but then also that opportunity that they saw to use this to build big bridges, grow partnership, et cetera, to make sure the city wasn't going to just walk away and have nothing to do with it. They wanted to be in partnership and in dialogue with the city and with the community. And by doing conservation easement, it meant that both parties had rights, and we were going to need to figure out how to work together and live together and be good partners for generations to come. So it came from them.
Okay. Another question. One of the questions someone has around land return is how to navigate ongoing colonial property taxes
Mm.
even after land is returned. How does that work in the case of return via cultural easement return as well as return via fee conveyance? So thinking about property taxes.
Mm. I'm not an expert in property taxes, and I'm afraid to say something that's not right. But the Sogorea Té Land Trust is a nonprofit, so they have certain tax exemptions and tax benefits that will apply to them in their ownership of these property rights. So I think that's as far as I want to take it, lest I say something that's not accurate.
Thank you. I also am aware, I do want to mention the Shwumi tax that I know Sogorea Té Land Trust also has created and started. And I would definitely defer to Sogorea Té Land Trust on their website. For the easement information as well is also located on their website, as well as their tax. And I will also be with Brendan on that part. But these are great questions. Thank you, everybody. We have about 5 more minutes. If there's any other, let's see. There was a little bit more of that to that question of, I'm curious if how this would be different if a tribe were federally recognized.
Yeah.
So working with federally recognized tribes, Brendan, do you have some experience with that?
Just a little bit. So the Kashaya Band of Poonians is a federally recognized tribe. So when they acquired the property in the Sonoma County coast, they have the ability to take that into trust, which is a process through the federal government that essentially makes it sort of foreign soil, right? It becomes owned by a sovereign nation, in the Kashaya Band of Poonians, and so their laws apply. That's not the case for the Confederated Villages of Lejeune. They're not federally recognized. This is also not a fee conveyance. One interesting thing that I learned in this process is that there is a mechanism in state law for giving prioritization to federally recognized tribes when conveying public lands. So there's state law that dictates how public lands can be disposed of. It generally gives preference to the disposition of public lands where they're going to be used for open space and parkland or for affordable housing development. And a few years back, there was a law that was passed to also give prioritization to federally recognized tribes. So a public agencies such as the City of Oakland, were there to be a federally recognized tribe here locally, we could then convey ownership of public land to that federally recognized tribe in a much more streamlined manner. But that wouldn't apply to the Confederated Villages of Lejeune since they're not federally recognized. So had they said, we would like to acquire this land in fee, in other words, own the property outright, that would have actually triggered state law that would have made that really difficult. I think at the end of the day, it would have been achievable, but it would have meant that we would have had to go through a process of first making this available for acquisition by other park districts or for the development of affordable housing, which wouldn't have been appropriate in this location. So we had to jump through a number of procedural hoops before we could even get to the place of being able to negotiate a conveyance of the property to the land trust. So, there's probably some room there for some new state legislation in recognition of the fact that the federal recognition system is problematic. It's difficult to be federally recognized. It's not a fair or foolproof system, and so that leaves some of our native communities behind. So there could be state law that would make it easier to actually do land back, where you're talking about fee conveyance to non-federally recognized tribes.
Great, thank you for that. Thanks, Brendan.
Actually, while we mentioned state law, sorry, just real quick, one thing that was neat about the fact that we're using a conservation easement here. So because we're, as the City of Oakland, a public agency, like every action that we take, every policy action essentially requires consideration under the California Environmental Quality Act. But there is within CEQA there are certain types of actions that are just categorically exempt. They're deemed to be environmentally positive, and exempted from sort of in-depth review. And because we used a conservation easement, and that's what by the way, a cultural conservation easement is just a conservation easement. The cultural thing is descriptive and helpful in understanding the conservation values and the purpose of that transaction and that tool. But in the eyes of the law, as I understand it, there's no such thing as a cultural conservation easement. There's just conservation easements. So there is a categorical exemption in CEQA for the conveyance of conservation easements. And so while we used a reserved interest conservation easement model and did convey a great deal of rights to the land trust, the fact that it was fit within a conservation easement meant that it was kind of, it was easy to do from a CEQA standpoint. We didn't get entangled in having to do an in-depth environmental analysis. It was deemed to be worthy enough for a categorical exemption. So that really helped our process. And that is a benefit of using a conservation easement as your tool.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that, by the way, Brendan. Like cultural is descriptive, but it's really a conservation easement in the language, right? In the property law language. And so there's actually one more question. Does anyone know from Facebook, does anyone know of any models for faith communities utilizing cultural or really conservation easements? Do you know of any examples of that possibly?
Don't really.
Yeah. So that's another opportunity. When I see these kinds of questions, I love that people are thinking about what's going on in their community, and also opening the doorways for other types of conversations and possibilities of what that could look like. So thank you for that question.
And can I, Sheridan, can I go back to a previous question?
Yeah, sure.
So there was a question from earlier about what's next in the evolution of easements for land return and what ideas I have. I spoke to like the heavy lift that there is in doing a conservation easement project, or at least what we experienced here, and the fact that it took us 5 years and all this effort. It also took a tribal partner that had, an incorporated nonprofit, and that had resources, and that was growing, and it had staff for stewardship, and could then take on the burden of property management. That's a big thing, and it's not going to apply everywhere. I'm really interested in how we can scale land back up through more lighter touch options as well. So I think that like fee conveyance, like outright return of land, like incredibly important. And there's like a big role for that. And I think there's also a role for using conservation easements as well. But I think like there's also even more opportunity in kind of the smaller like sprinkling of rights that can happen too. Like thinking about what Save the Redwoods League did at Stewart's Point, I think is a great example where you already have, say, the Redwoods League as the owner, it's a very well-resourced conservation organization. They own that property, they manage it, and I think they manage it pretty well. It's got a conservation easement on it that's held by the county, open space district there. So a lot of the rights were already claimed, and there's already a lot of resources and attention focused on management of the property. But, the tribe really needed access to the coast, and they may have wanted more than what they got from that access easement. But just the access easement alone is a really meaningful thing. And it's probably something that can happen a lot more quickly. And when you think about organizations that are, or tribes that are like even less resourced than the Sogorea Té Land Trust, where maybe they're just now kind of being able to reconstitute their community in a way that they've been unable to do for a while. It's going to be hard to take on stewardship responsibility for a piece of ground, but having the right to go back to a place, even if it's like prescribed periods of time, just to be in that place and have ceremony and to collect, whatever it may be, like there's a time and a place for that. And that can be very meaningful. And it's small enough that I think it can be taken to scale and can be spread across much more of our land. So I think that's like, as far as like what ideas I have, I think that's like a huge opportunity space.
That's great. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you for really highlighting that there's multiple ways, right? And there's going to be multiple ways and opportunities to create what we call at Redbud steps to land back, even, or that it may not be full land return, but there's ways to work towards that. Everybody has an opportunity or a way to contribute to that kind of support and supporting sovereignty in that way, tribal and native sovereignty in communities. So thank you for highlighting that and knowing that there's multiple ways and there's still opportunity for more things to come from this process. So one more question for you, Brendan. Can you share your information for others who may have more questions for you? So even after our conversation that we're about to close in a few minutes for our lunchtime conversation, but yeah, is there a way that that folks who may have other questions for you or get in contact with you?
Yeah.
Is that an option, an opportunity?
Yeah. I'm going to put my email address in the chat here. So folks are welcome to reach out to me, and just be patient if I don't get back right away. There's a lot going on, but I'm committed to continuing to help support the land back movement. So I certainly am happy to do what I can. So I'll go ahead and hit enter, and there's my email.
Great. And then you're with the City of Oakland, right? That's so right. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining this awesome conversation. Thank you again, Brendan, for sharing your experience and knowledge. Yes. And that pretty much concludes our time together. Again, thank you for being available to reach out. If folks have other questions for Brendan, please contact him through the City of Oakland. For those of you who don't see his email in the chat. And of course, Redbud Resource Group, this is recorded. This will be shared again on our website at redbudresourcegroup.org under our Going Beyond Land Acknowledgements tab on our website. We have a lot of resources there to also access that speak to this kind of conversation and way to support Native communities, to be a valued partner to Native communities, and to support Native and tribal sovereignty. So there are many ways. Thank you. Thank you again, Brendan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.